When a farm horse named Jim is thrust into the chaos of war, no one expects the miracles that follow. As battles intensify, Jim's inexplicable abilities save countless lives, leaving soldiers and generals in awe. But with each heroic act, a dark secret emerges. Can Jim's final, desperate gambit prevent total destruction? The rolling hills of Kentucky stretched out before Jim, a young chestnut stallion with a distinctive white blaze. His days were filled with the simple pleasures of farm life, galloping through green pastures, feeling the warm sun on his back. But even in this idyllic setting, whispers of war reached the farm. Jim noticed the tension in his human caretakers, their hushed conversations, and worried glances toward the horizon. He couldn't understand their words, but he sensed a change coming. One crisp autumn morning, the farm's tranquility was shattered by the arrival of men in blue uniforms. Their boots kicked up dust as they strode purposefully towards the barn. Jim watched curiously from his stall as the farmer argued with the soldiers, his voice rising in frustration. Eventually, the farmer's shoulders slumped in defeat. He approached Jim, gently stroking his muzzle and whispering words of comfort. Jim nuzzled him, sensing the man's sadness, but not understanding its cause. Before Jim could comprehend what was happening, he found himself being led away from the only home he'd ever known. The soldiers efficiently fitted him with unfamiliar tack, their movements brusque, but not unkind. As they guided him onto a road lined with other requisitioned horses, Jim looked back at the farm one last time. The farmer's wife stood in the doorway, wiping tears from her eyes. Jim whinnied softly, a farewell to the life he was leaving behind. The journey to the Union camp was long and confusing. Jim was surrounded by the nervous energy of other horses and the determined march of soldiers. Upon arrival, he was overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and smells of military life. Rows of white tents stretched as far as he could see, the air filled with the clanging of metal, shouts of men, and the acrid scent of gunpowder. As he was led to a makeshift stable, Jim caught sight of a man whose presence seemed to command respect from all around him. General Ulysses S. Grant. General Grant's eyes met Jim's, and for a moment, the chaos of the camp faded away. The general approached, his steps measured and confident. He ran a calloused hand along Jim's neck, murmuring words of approval. Jim stood tall, instinctively sensing the importance of this man. A young private nearby whispered in awe, "That's General Grant himself." The general nodded to the stable hands. "This one will do nicely. See that he's properly trained." With that, Jim's new life as a cavalry horse began. Weeks of rigorous training followed. Jim learned to respond to bugle calls, to stand steady amidst the crack of gunfire, and to carry his rider with precision through complex maneuvers. The routine was grueling, but Jim's inherent intelligence and calm demeanor set him apart. General Grant often observed the training sessions, his eyes following Jim's progress with interest. As autumn turned to winter, tension in the camp grew. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of an impending battle, their faces a mix of excitement and fear. The day of Jim's first battle dawned cold and misty. The air thrummed with nervous energy as soldiers mounted up and formed ranks. Jim felt the weight of General Grant on his back, the man's steady hands on the reins, a source of reassurance. As they moved out, the sounds of distant cannon fire grew louder. Jim's nostrils flared at the acrid smell of smoke, but he pressed on, guided by his training and the general's sure command. Suddenly, they crested a hill, and the full chaos of battle lay before them. The valley below was a maelstrom of smoke, fire, and clashing armies. Lesser horses reared and balked at the cacophony, but Jim stood firm. General Grant's voice cut through the din, ordering a charge. Without hesitation, Jim leapt forward, hooves thundering across the muddy ground. Bullets whizzed past, shells exploded nearby, yet Jim remained focused, carrying his rider steadily through the storm of battle. As the smoke cleared and the battle subsided, Jim stood steady amidst the aftermath, his coat flecked with mud and sweat, but otherwise unharmed. General Grant dismounted, patting Jim's neck with a mixture of relief and admiration. "You've got the heart of a lion, old boy," he murmured. Nearby soldiers gazed at Jim with newfound respect, whispering about his unwavering courage under fire. Among them, a young private named Thomas approached cautiously, his eyes wide with wonder. "Sir," Thomas addressed the general, "may I tend to your horse? He's earned some extra care after today." Grant nodded approvingly, and Thomas set to work, gently brushing Jim's coat and checking for any signs of injury. As he worked, Thomas spoke softly to Jim, recounting the day's events from his perspective. Jim listened, finding comfort in the young man's soothing voice. A bond began to form between them, forged in the crucible of their shared experience. Over the following weeks, Thomas became Jim's primary caretaker. When the general wasn't riding, he'd sneak Jim extra apples and spend time just talking to him, sharing his hopes and fears about the war. Jim came to look forward to these quiet moments amidst the constant tension of camp life. Even General Grant noticed the positive effect Thomas had on Jim, often finding the young private asleep in the stable, leaning against Jim's flank. One night, as a full moon hung low over the camp, the peace was shattered by sudden gunfire. Confederate raiders had launched a surprise attack under cover of darkness. Chaos erupted as sleepy soldiers scrambled for their weapons. Jim, alert in his stable, sensed the danger before many humans did. He kicked at his stall door, his frantic neighing alerting Thomas, who had been on night watch nearby. Thanks to Jim's warning, the camp rallied quickly, repelling the raiders before they could do significant damage. The skirmish left its mark on the camp, both physically and emotionally. As dawn broke, Jim watched soldiers tend to their wounded comrades, the air heavy with groans of pain and the metallic scent of blood. General Grant strode through the camp, his face grim but determined. He paused by Jim's stable, absently stroking the horse's muzzle as he conferred with his officers. Jim sensed the weight of responsibility on the general's shoulders and stood quietly, offering what comfort he could with his steady presence. As the campaign pressed on, battles became more frequent and intense. Jim carried Grant through firefights and charges, always steady, always brave. But war spares no one, not even the most courageous. During a particularly fierce engagement, a stray bullet grazed Jim's flank. The pain was sharp and sudden, but Jim didn't falter, carrying Grant to safety before the injury could be noticed. It was only after the battle, as Thomas tended to him, that the wound was discovered. A hush fell over the stable as news of Jim's injury spread. Captain Sarah Lewis, a Union nurse known for her skill with both human and animal patients, was quickly summoned. Her gentle hands probed the wound as Jim stood stoically. "He's a brave one," she murmured, cleaning the injury with practiced efficiency. Many horses would have thrown their rider with a wound like this. General Grant, standing nearby, nodded solemnly. "He's more than a horse," he said quietly. "He's a soldier, through and through." As Sarah dressed the wound, She spoke softly to Jim, her voice soothing. "You'll have a scar, my friend, but wear it proudly. It's a badge of your courage." Jim nickered softly in response, drawing a smile from the tired nurse. The incident highlighted the often overlooked sacrifices of animals in war. In the days that followed, Sarah made a point of checking on Jim regularly. Her visits a welcome respite for both horse and human caretakers, amid the harsh realities of the ongoing conflict. As autumn's last leaves fell, a bitter chill swept through the Union camp. The war ground to a near halt, with both sides hunkering down for the long winter ahead. Jim's wound had healed, leaving a pale scar on his flank, but the real challenge was yet to come. Icy winds howled through the camp, snow piled high, and supplies dwindled. Soldiers huddled around meager fires, their spirits as frozen as the ground beneath their feet. In the makeshift stables, Jim and the other horses stood close together, sharing what warmth they could. General Grant paced the camp, his brow furrowed with concern. Morale was low, and desertion was becoming a real threat. In these dark days, he found himself spending more time in the stables, often talking to Jim as he might to a trusted confidant. "What are we to do, old friend?" he'd murmur, his breath visible in the frigid air. Jim would nicker softly, nuzzling the general's shoulder, his steady presence a comfort amidst the uncertainty. Thomas, despite the cold, remained diligent in his care for Jim and the other horses. His once cheerful chatter had been replaced by determined silence as he worked, his young face gaunt with hunger and worry. One particularly harsh night, Thomas collapsed in the stable, overcome by cold and exhaustion. Jim, sensing the boy's distress, positioned himself next to Thomas, sharing his body heat. When the stable master found them in the morning, Thomas was huddled against Jim, saved from the worst of the cold by the horse's protective stance. As word of Jim's actions spread, it sparked a change in the camp. Soldiers began to rally, inspired by the horse's unwavering strength and loyalty. They shared rations, looked out for one another, and fought against the creeping despair. Grant, recognizing the impact, made a point of riding Jim through the camp daily. The sight of the resilient horse and resolute general, a powerful symbol of perseverance. Slowly, as the winter began to wane, a new determination took hold. If Jim could stand strong through this brutal season, they could too. As spring's first tentative buds appeared, the war machine creaked back to life. General Grant, eager to capitalize on the renewed morale, planned a daring reconnaissance mission. With Jim as his mount, he set out with a small team to gather intelligence on Confederate positions. The group moved swiftly and silently through enemy territory, the warming air filled with tension. Jim's ears swiveled constantly, alert for any sign of danger. His keen senses had saved them more than once on this perilous journey. Their luck, however, couldn't hold forever. As they crested a hill, they stumbled upon a Confederate patrol. Shots rang out, scattering the Union soldiers. In the chaos, Grant and Jim found themselves cut off from the rest of their team. With Confederate riders in hot pursuit, they plunged into a dense forest. Jim navigated the treacherous terrain with remarkable agility, leaping over fallen logs and weaving between trees. Grant, trusting in Jim's instincts, gave him his head, focusing instead on watching for pursuers. As night fell, they found themselves deep in unfamiliar territory. Grant, realizing they were lost, dismounted to check their bearings. Jim, however, remained restless, pawing at the ground and snorting softly. Recognizing Jim's agitation, Grant decided to trust the horse's instincts once again. "All right, boy," he whispered, remounting. "Show me the way home." Single quotes. Jim needed no further encouragement. With determined steps, he set off through the darkness, his sense of direction unerring. Hours passed, the moon their only light. Just as exhaustion began to overtake them both, Jim's ears perked up. In the distance, barely audible, came the sound of a Union bugle call. With renewed energy, Jim pressed forward, finally breaking through the tree line to reveal the welcoming sight of their camp. As they rode in, soldiers gathered around, amazed at their return. Grant, usually reserved, couldn't hide his emotion as he patted Jim's neck. "This horse," he announced to the crowd, "has the heart of a lion and the wisdom of an owl. We owe him our lives." The war entered its final stages, and the Union forces prepared for the decisive Appomattox campaign. The air buzzed with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Jim, now a veteran warhorse, sensed the shift in atmosphere. General Grant spent long hours poring over maps, his face etched with the weight of impending decisions. When he finally emerged from his tent, his eyes met Jim's, and a silent understanding passed between them. This would be their greatest challenge yet. As dawn broke on the day of battle, a heavy mist clung to the ground. Soldiers mounted up, their faces grim with determination. Jim stood steady as Grant swung into the saddle, his familiar weight a comfort amidst the tension. The general's voice rang out, rallying the troops for one last push. As they moved out, Jim's hooves beat a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the thunder of thousands of men on the march. They crested a hill, and the battlefield lay before them. The Confederate lines stretched out, a formidable barrier to victory. Grant's voice cut through the din, ordering a charge. Jim didn't hesitate, launching forward with all the strength and courage he'd built over years of war. They led the charge, a beacon for the troops behind them. Bullets whizzed by, cannon fire shook the earth, but Jim remained focused, his powerful strides eating up the ground. Suddenly, a shell exploded nearby. Jim felt a searing pain in his leg but refused to falter. He could feel Grant's weight shift, knew the general had been hit too, but neither horse nor rider broke stride. With a final surge of strength, they broke through the Confederate lines, the Union forces pouring in behind them. As the enemy began to retreat, Jim finally slowed, his breath coming in heavy gasps. Grant leaned forward, whispering words of praise. They had done it. The war was all but won. In the aftermath of the decisive battle, the true cost became clear. Jim's leg injury was severe, and for a time, it seemed he might not recover. General Grant, nursing his own wounds, visited the makeshift veterinary tent daily. Captain Sarah Lewis worked tirelessly, her skilled hands tending to Jim with the same care she showed human patients. "He's a fighter," she'd assured the general, though worry creased her brow. Thomas, now a battle-hardened soldier himself, spent every free moment by Jim's side, whispering encouragement and memories of quieter days. As news of the impending Confederate surrender spread, so too did tales of Jim's bravery. Soldiers gathered around campfires, recounting how the stalwart horse had led the final charge, despite his injuries. Jim's story became a symbol of the courage and sacrifice that had won the war. Even as he lay recovering, his impact rippled through the ranks, boosting morale and fostering a newfound respect for the animal companions who had served alongside them. Weeks passed, and slowly, Jim began to improve. The day he managed to stand without assistance, A cheer went up from the gathered soldiers. Grant, his own arm in a sling, smiled broadly. "You've more than earned your rest, old friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As the army began its slow demobilization, plans were made for Jim's future. It was unanimously agreed that he deserved a peaceful retirement, far from the sounds and sense of war that had defined his life for so long. In the years that followed, Jim lived out his days on Grant's farm, his presence a constant reminder of the bonds forged in battle. His story spread, inspiring better treatment for war animals across the nation. On warm summer evenings, Grant could often be found in the pasture, sitting with his old Warhorse, reliving memories both bitter and sweet. And though Jim's battle scars faded with time, the legacy of his unwavering courage lived on, a testament to the quiet heroes of a nation divided and reunited.